Before you flip your first house or your next house, you need to watch this video. Hey, if you don't know me, my name is Jason Balin from Hard Money Bankers. In 2007, we started our lending company and we funded 4,000 flips ever since. So I've learned a little bit about what deals work and what don't. Let me share my screen with you really quickly so you can see our first time flipper guide and exactly what to do and what mistakes to stay away from on your next flip. So one thing that is missing on this chart, which is the most important thing, is knowing what your exit strategy is, right? So I'm just going to put exit right here. I'm going to draw that out a little bit. Exit for your exit strategy. Are you going to be flipping this house, or are you going to be holding on to this property as a long-term rental property? There's obviously pros and cons of both. If you are looking for quick cash, or if there's a big equity spread, flipping a house might be the best option. If you're looking for long-term income, maybe some passive income, owning a rental property. Now, just keep in mind, if you're going to do a long-term rental on this thing, you're probably going to need to get exit financing, right? So bank financing or traditional financing after you renovate the house and you put a tenant in there. So chances are you're probably going to need good credit or a credit partner. Just something to think about. So let's go through this flipping guide real quick. And then I've got a bunch of stories to go through as well, some tips and some tricks along the way in this video. So make sure you definitely tune in until the end, because I can tell you which deals are typically the safest to do, which ones have a little bit higher risk. So we'll go through all that as well. So obviously you want to determine your realistic profit expectations, not necessarily just gross profit, but also net profit. Now, usually what happens is the rule of thumb for a lot of real estate investors is they try to make like a 20% profit on their deals. So, and this is based off the cost. So let's say you buy a property for $200,000 and it needs $50,000 in renovations, right? So that's a $250,000 flip, $250,000 in costs. Now, obviously, you have holding costs and financing costs, things like that. We're going to get through that in a little bit. But the rule of thumb is if you're into this thing at $250,000, you try to make a 20% profit margin. That's a $50,000 profit, right? You're trying to make about $50,000 in profit in this particular deal. And that's the game plan on it, about $50,000. And keep in mind, not gross profit, net profit before taxes. So let's say you buy it for 200, you put 50 into it, that's 250. You have another like $80,000 in costs, that's 280. You know, you want to be able to sell it for 320 plus in order to get that $50,000 profit margin. Now, when we're in a market where it's challenging to find good opportunities and the margins are tighter, some of these investors will go down to 10% profit margin. So right, their costs are 250, and then they end up doing a 10% profit margin instead, and that gets them down to a $25,000 profit. Personally, I think that's pretty slim, but try to stick to about 20%. That's typically a rule of thumb to make sure you're on the safe side. Now, obviously, neighborhood selection has a lot to do with that as well. I typically don't invest in areas that I don't know. I recommend trying to stick to areas that you do know. It's just a lot safer. And if you don't know those areas, let's say you're new to a neighborhood, no problem. Just learn that area, drive by there, familiarize, talk to neighbors, talk to other real estate investors, realtors, mortgage brokers, things like that know that area, and just learn it. And I like to stay in property values that are median housing price neighborhoods in general. Like median housing price neighborhoods typically have the least amount of risk for a few reasons, right? Now, the lower end areas, although, you might want to, some people are attract to the lower end areas mostly because they're enticing, because there's a smaller barrier to entry to get in there. And you also typically will need less funds, but they're also very volatile in those particular areas. So on the other side, you might want to be in the higher end pricing area. Let's say you have a lot of, capital that you're willing to invest in this venture. You might want to get into higher end price point neighborhoods. The problem is if you have like a 10% decrease in value during, maybe a bad market, like that can wipe out hundreds of thousands of dollars. So median housing price neighborhoods is where the majority of the houses that are being built are. A lot of first-time home buyers, some people that are buying for their second house, they can afford in those areas. So the purpose, and I'm just going to put $400,000 ARV up here, just because I'm going to use that as like a reference for a lot of this. And I know that $400,000 might be on the low end ARV after repair value in some areas, or it might be in the high end, depending on, what part of the country or what neighborhoods that you're living in or you're investing in. But let's just use that because we're going to reference that number here as we move forward on some of this stuff. But I like to say, try to stick to those particular areas. The median housing price neighborhoods is typically what has the least amount of risk. And also try to stick to areas, especially if you're newer or if you haven't done a ton of these deals yet, try to stick to areas that are built, 1970s or later, 1970s, 80s, 90s. And I know not all areas are like that, but as soon as you get into areas that are like in the 1900s, like those are risky deals. There's so much more risk and so much more improvements in construction component risk than you're even aware of what needs to get done and what doesn't need to get done. But I always say, stick to projects that maybe need like a lipstick on a pig, a smaller project, nothing that needs major overhaul construction, and things like that. So anything kind of built, later on, the better. There's less risk on that. One other tip related to this that I think is important is think about neighborhoods. And I'm sure this might be a neighborhood that you live in, or it might be a neighborhood that you're familiar with. Think about the neighborhoods where the worst property, like the crappiest property of all time, you could pick up for like $280,000, $290,000, $300,000. But then the nicest house in that neighborhood caps out at $400,000. There's not a huge variance, right, between a $300,000 crappy house and a $400,000 beautiful house. That's only like a 25% discount on that. Okay, so now think of the complete opposite of that. Think about an area, and this might be in like the closest city to you, where the nicest property is $400,000, but the crappiest property is like 50, 60, 70, 80, or $100,000, right? That's like an upside down type of deal, right? So it's $100,000 for the worst property because it needs such major renovations, and it's a $400,000 for the nicest property, right? That's a huge gap. So much. Yeah, there might be a lot of sweat equity. You might look at it, but there's also so much risk of what potentially happens. On the other side, there's the $300,000 property for the worst house and the $400,000 for the best house. Now, chances are there's probably not much profit margin in some of those because you have a homeowner who's just going to buy it for $300,000. They're going to put $80,000 or $100,000 into them themselves and just have this nice property for themselves. And on the other side, the $100,000 one, you're only going to deal with people that are very speculative or experts that really know that area, and they're going to make up margin by just limited construction costs. Maybe they have lower construction costs than you might have. It's so much more speculative. Ideally, you want to be somewhere in the middle. We can use this number again, $400,000 ARV. Maybe a property that you can buy for, $250,000 and put $50,000 into it, or $60,000 or $70,000 into it. And then you take your holding costs out, your financing costs, and you can profit that $40,000, $50,000 on the deal. So that's kind of where we're looking at. That's kind of not just the safest, but that's the most consistent types of deals out there. And that's, where a lot of investors really should kind of mess with. So obviously you got to understand your permits and your inspections, building codes, things like that. This obviously differs. You might be in a neighborhood that, as long as you're not doing anything with like major mechanicals or structural work, you might not need any permitting at all. And then some, you go in there and, hey, you're putting a slap of paint on here. I need to, get a fee for a permit just to do that. Or it might be in an historical district, and even if you're just doing exterior painting, they might have certain paint colors or roofing colors and things like that. So it's important to do so. You can obviously always call permitting office. Real quick tip is talk to your local real estate agent or broker that might know that area, or other real estate investors. A really good hack is if you see construction crews and real estate investors in areas doing renovations, go talk to them and see kind of what they're working with. And, that could be a helpful tip to, see what they have. All right. So obviously cash needed. Now, I know we talked about exit strategy, know what your exit strategy up front, but you also got to know what resources that you have, right? If you don't have, typically you either have cash to do the deal or you don't have a lot of cash to do the deal. If you don't have a lot of cash to do the deal, honestly, on your first flip, like that could be challenging, right? Because you're going to need funds, right? You're going to need funds either, even if you're getting high leverage or high financing, you're going to have down payment money, closing costs, monthly payments, carrying costs. The contractor is probably going to want you to put up capital up front to start the work. There's just money that overages. There's money that you're going to need. So think about what your investable capital is. Could be other people's money. It could be your own money, but investable capital. Like if you have $10,000 of investable capital, either yourself or somebody else's, like it is going to be hard to do much besides maybe wholesaling. It's going to be hard to flip a property. You just probably not going to have enough resources to do so. Cash-wise resources. You might have to find other capital partners to do so. So I usually like to say that you should have about, and this might be on the high side to think about, but like I usually like to think that you need about 30% minimum of whatever your costs are going to be, and about 40% of whatever your after repair value is going to be. That's kind of the rule of thumb, give or take. And it doesn't always have to be that much, but you don't want this liability, this asset to turn into a liability because you can't support the debt service or you can't complete the project. So it's important to kind of think about. So, in general, and we're going to talk about financing here and how you get the funds for some of these deals here in a second, but in general, if you're buying a property for $250,000 and it needs 50 grand in work, you're going to need, let's see, $75,000 into the deal cash. Plus you're going to need some money to start the work. And then the lender will typically reimburse you for completed work. You might have some overages. So like you need about $100,000 liquidity on a deal like that. I'm not saying that you can't get it done for cheaper. And keep in mind, when I say investable capital that you need, that includes other people's money. If you're raising money for other from a capital investor, potentially you're partnering with somebody who's bringing in money. In general, someone's going to need to come up with that money. I know real estate investors that buy all their supplies through Home Depot credit cards, and then they pay back the credit card after they get a construction draw from their hard money lender. So that's an option as well, but it's all things that you got to take in consideration. And that's a big thing. I mean, these properties, listen, on the lending side, I see it all the time. A lot of real estate investors go over budget, or they go over their timelines, and their holding costs just end up being too expensive, and the asset turns into a liability just because they don't have the reserves to do. So doing needs analysis is, I think one of the most important part, the deal analysis. Too many real estate investors just don't understand what the property is they're buying. They go to a local real estate agent, they look on Zillow, and they're like, "Oh yeah, you can sell it to 400. That I can sell for $400,000." Well, I'm all about taking advice from people and doing your own diligence and talking to people to see. But in essence, unless that person has an economic interest in the property, meaning like you're the investor, you're the one who's either going to make money or lose money on this deal, it's your responsibility to validate that and determine really what the property value is going to be. Okay. That's the most important part on this. I'm not saying don't take advice from a real estate agent or real estate investor or appraiser. Certainly do. But you're the one ultimately responsible. So you need to make that decision. Ideally, if you can figure out a way to get access to MLS locally, that's obviously helpful because you need to know what your after repair value is. Now, typically, as a real estate investor, you want to buy up to 65% of the after repair value minus construction costs. Some people say 70 or 75. To be cautious, 65 is typically the right number. So if the after repair value is $400,000, 65% of that is $260,000. And then let's say your construction costs are $50,000. That means your maxed loan or the max purchase price that you would want is $210,000. $210,000 purchase price, $50,000 in construction, that's $260,000, which is 65% of the $400,000 after repair value. So that's kind of ideally what you want to do. The other thing to take into consideration, I think a lot of real estate investors forget, is to make sure you're buying it at even if there's a lot of equity and there's an ARV, make sure you also buy it at a good price based on the as-is value and what other real estate investors would pay for it. I know that most people buy properties at like 100% of the investor price, and that's fine. But you want to be safe on that because, like, God forbid something happens and you're not able to do the project like you thought. You want to make sure you have enough equity in it to build into it. A lot of real estate investors want to get high leverage on these deals to limit the cash out of pocket, and I get all that. But having equity in a property, not just sweat equity, but real equity in a property and cash down on it, yeah, you're tying up your own money, but it gives you outlets if something happens. And you also don't have, the high debt service they have to cover if you put additional cash. So putting additional funds into a deal is not a bad thing, especially kind of upfront on an early deal, because deals just aren't going to go exactly as planned. They're just not. Construction overages, market changes, things like that. So you got to have some backup plans. Now, related financing options, typically there's a few options. You can go to a bank, you can go to a hard money lender, a private lender, use a HELOC from, maybe your primary residence. Maybe you pay all cash. Maybe you get a joint venture partner. They put up half. They put up all the money and you split the profits 50-50. It really depends on what the case is. Coming from a hard money lender, I see a lot of real estate investors that do very well when they use private hard money lending capital. Now, obviously, you can go to a private lender if you know them, who might be a passive non-professional and potentially get cheaper terms. But you want to make sure you also have the flexibility to work with them as well on things. The reason that we always think hard money is a good option is you're dealing with an actual business that's in the business of doing loans and writing loans and working with real estate investors. So, they can help out. They can kind of look over your shoulder sometimes if you need assistance on a deal, or what do I do in this case? What do I do in this, in this case? And it's not like a private lender where like all of a sudden you run into a problem, and the private lender demands their money back. Or it's not really working with a bank that has strict guidelines that you have to follow perfectly no matter what. But again, for each their own. If you have 45, 60 days to close on a deal, the time isn't of the essence, and you can go to your bank and get cheaper capital, that could be a really good deal. Hard money lenders will typically, they work with a lot of real estate investors because real estate investors need to close very, very quickly in a matter of days or maybe a week. So a hard money lender can accomplish that. Now, throughout your team in general, a contractor, a real estate agent, obviously a hard money lender is a good person to have on your team as well. But a real estate agent, not necessarily that you just know, because most people know a real estate agent, but a real estate agent that knows that area and understands how to work with real estate investors in general. That's the right agent. That's an important one. Not all of them are alike, and listen, they don't even have to be a huge agent. It's just somebody who understands the real estate investment transaction and can help you and knows that area. Same with contractors. I'd recommend, contractors that know exactly what you're looking for, contractors that work with real estate investors. You don't want to get homeowner pricing for this stuff. It'll be way too expensive. You want to work with a contractor that can move very, very quickly, that's used to dealing with real estate investors, and that they don't cut corners, licensed, bonded, and things like that. That's an important part of your team. And I'm all about starting small, create a relationship, give somebody a try. I'm never about micromanaging people, but like communicate with them, communicate, make sure you have clear expectations of what you want to do. And like, this should be a big focus. This shouldn't just be like a passive thing that you're doing. You want to be active and, set boundaries, set expectations accordingly on both parties. And then obviously you have, your renovation priorities of like what your game plan is. If it's one of your first deals, I would not do major construction. I think I've seen major construction ruin real estate investors, especially on their first few deals. There's so much that can go wrong in that particular case. Do a smaller project. Do something that's built in the 70s, 80s, 90s. Maybe it needs $40,000, $50,000 in work, new flooring, paint, new kitchen, new bathrooms. Maybe a new roof, some landscaping, some fixtures, and things like that. Nothing with major construction. You make your life way easier to do that. Obviously, finished basements, that's another thing. You can recoup a lot of funds if you have a nice finished basement. In the cities, they call them like club rooms. Kitchen upgrades, bathroom upgrades, things like that. It'll make stuff way, 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 way easier. And then obviously, one thing we didn't really talk about is funky property types. or just, untraditional property types, right? So this is mostly single family residence, maybe some townhouses. When you start dealing with some condos, beware, depending on the age of the condo, what the assessments are, what the condo fees are. I remember, we had a condo early on, and as an investment, and the market did really, really well. So the condo increased in value pretty rapidly, but it was also an older condo that needed a lot of work. And because of that, they had to assess all the members to do so. So the condo fee just skyrocketed. And as the condo fee went up, the value of the property went down, right? Because of the affordability of the new homeowner, it was all in line with what the payment was. So like I'd stay away from high-rise condos. All high-rise condos typically have high assessments and condo fees because they have elevator shafts, and there's just a lot of common area maintenance that has to be covered. So when you're dealing with single families or townhouses, you're dealing with small homeowners associations if they even have a homeowner association. So it's less, because one thing that's never going to go down in price is taxes and condo fees and insurance costs. So all that happens. So all that stuff has to be taken in consideration on your deal. So again, a few quick tips to start with. We'll recap all this very, very, very quickly. Try to stick to about a 20% profit margin. That's always smart. Stick to areas that or that you can learn, ideally median housing price neighborhoods. Understand your permitting and inspection process. Figure out what your cash needs are going to be and how much you have to put into a particular deal. Understanding how to value those deals. Figuring out what type of financing is best to have in place. Make sure you build your team of contractors, real estate agents, lenders. Know what your construction priorities are going to be ahead of time, budget all that out. And then most importantly, what is your exit strategy? And this is your first time Flipper's Guide. Again, my name is Jason Balin at Hard Money Bankers. If you have any questions related to this topic, feel free to comment on the video. Happy to answer any questions that you have. And if you're looking for a private loan, a hard money loan, reach out to us at hardmoneybankers.com. Until next video.